He thought the land beside his would die the same way his almost did. Silent, neglected, forgotten. But when a young woman in worn boots and 2 new gloves showed up with a tractor she didn't know how to start, he didn't turn away. He thought he was just helping her finish a harvest. What he didn't know, she was planting more than crops. She was laying roots that might finally grow where nothing else had. Before we dive in, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment. Where in the world are you watching from? The tractor coughed, lurched, and finally gave in with a wheeze that felt like a last breath. Mason hit the brake hard, grinding to a stop mid-row, dust swirling around him like smoke from something already burned. The engine ticked in the silence, mocking him. He sat there, jaw tight, hands gripping the wheel like he could will it back to life. It didn't even sputter, just died. The field stretched around him in every direction, parched, brittle, and bone-dry. Not a hint of green in sight. Rows that used to run full and proud now looked like a graveyard, the earth split and curling at the edges like old parchment. 9 weeks without rain, and the forecast kept teasing like it had something to offer and always left empty-handed. The soil wasn't dead, not officially, but it had stopped trying. Same as he had some days. He climbed down slow, boots sinking half an inch into the fine dust that coated everything. It clung to his jeans, his knuckles, the sweat at his temples, the kind of dust that got in your teeth and stayed there. He popped the hood, already knowing what he'd see, what he'd hoped wouldn't be true. The belt had frayed clean through, rubber shards dangled like sinew, no spares. The last one had gone to the baler 2 weeks back. He stared into the engine like it might blink first, then slammed the hood shut harder than necessary. The echo rolled across the field and came back empty. No cattle lowing, no birds, just wind brushing dry stalks like a whisper that wouldn't say what it really meant. He tipped his hat back and looked up. The sky was a flat, washed-out blue. The kind of sky that didn't give a damn about a man's last crop or how much of his mortgage was past due. His hands shook, just slightly. He clenched them to stop it. There wasn't time for shaking. Not when the field was this far gone. Not when the only thing holding this place up was habit and pride. And maybe a lie he kept telling himself, that if he just worked hard enough, the land would remember how to love him back. The for sale sign was gone by morning, just the splintered post left, leaning crooked in the dirt like it had been yanked out of place and forgotten. Mason spotted it on the drive back from town, truck bed rattling with half a pallet of feed and a length of chain he couldn't afford but needed anyway. He slowed as he passed the fence line, squinting into the field beyond. The orchard had been dead for years. Trees still stood, skeletal outlines against the pale sky, but nothing bloomed. No fruit, no birdsong, just rows of quiet reminders that things don't always come back. The grass had swallowed most of the footpaths, and the old farmhouse at the edge looked like it was holding its breath, one shutter hanging by a single rusted hinge. A ghost of something that once mattered. He put the truck in park just long enough to light a cigarette, knuckles creaking as he brought the flame to his lips. A habit he'd quit twice already, but some days begged for old vices. New tire tracks cut through the gravel shoulder, wide and uncertain. Too careful to be local, someone had been out there, and stayed long enough to decide. So that was that. Sold. He took one last drag and flicked the butt into the dust. The land was no good. He'd said that the first time the sign went up 2 years back, and again when the bank repossessed it from the Hendersons. Too many roots left to rot, too much pride buried in the topsoil. You don't buy a place like that unless you're desperate or dumb, or both. He turned back toward his own drive, the house barely visible through the sun haze and broken fence posts. Maybe whoever bought the orchard would last a season. Maybe they'd slap some paint on the porch, try to plant a row of something cheerful. Lavender, probably. Touristy, foolish. But the land would teach them quick. It didn't care about hope or hustle. It remembered things. And the last thing anyone needed around here Was another wide-eyed dreamer thinking they could coax life out of something that had already decided to die. The truck rattled in on a Tuesday late morning, the kind of hour when heat was just starting to turn the dirt mean and the wind couldn't be bothered to blow. Mason heard it before he saw it, the low, uneven grind of gears unfamiliar with gravel, followed by a sharp backfire that sent birds up from the wire fence like they'd been shot at. He stepped onto the porch, wiping his hands on a rag that used to be a T-shirt, and watched the dust trail roll toward the old Roth orchard. U-Haul, oversized, packed sloppy, boxes stacked high behind loose tarps that flapped like something trying to escape. The front cab was clean enough to look new, but the bumper had a dent like a story nobody wanted to tell. The truck jerked to a stop near the gate, tires skidding slightly in the powdery drive. She got out a moment later. Slim frame, brown boots too clean, jeans stiff like they'd come off a mannequin. She shaded her eyes with one hand and stared at the house like she was waiting for it to introduce itself. Her hair was pinned back, but already losing the battle. A clipboard tucked under one arm. She was chewing the inside of her cheek. Mason knew the look. Hope mixed with that sharp edge of, "What the hell have I done?" She saw him, hesitated, then raised a hand. Not a big wave, just a small gesture, palm out, fingers loose. Her expression asked for something, acknowledgement maybe, or just proof the place wasn't entirely empty. He didn't wave back, just nodded once and stepped inside. Later, he watched from the kitchen window as she wrestled with the tailgate, struggling to drop the ramp. No help, no crew, just her and the heat and a box marked kitchen that hit the dirt hard enough to crack. She crouched beside it, not moving, like she might cry. Then she didn't. Just pulled the box upright and moved on. Mason didn't go out, didn't ask if she needed anything, didn't plan to. The orchard had new blood, sure. But the dirt still remembered the last folks who thought they could save it. It started just after dawn. Mason was feeding the chickens when he caught the shape of her out there, half silhouetted against the tree line, a pair of shears in her hand, too small for the job, sleeves rolled past her elbows like she meant business. The orchard, still sick and overgrown, towered around her in wild, brittle defiance. Trees that hadn't been touched in years loomed over her like they knew better. She picked a limb at random, squinted at it like it had personally insulted her, and snapped the shears shut. Nothing happened. She frowned, tried again, jaw clenched this time. The blade slipped. The branch shuddered. She stumbled back, nearly twisted her ankle in the dry ruts at her feet. Wrong shoes. Mason noticed that first. Flats, thin-soled, dusty now but not broken in, the kind city girls wore to brunch, not to war with an orchard. Her hair stuck to her face in damp strands, her T-shirt blotched with sweat already. She had no gloves, just soft hands and stubborn posture. She was bleeding from one knuckle and didn't even know it. He leaned against the fence post, arms crossed, watching her fight the branch, like she might convince it to obey, through sheer will. She was talking to herself, words he couldn't hear, but the tone said frustration, desperation, maybe something mean. She tried another limb. This one gave, but crooked, half-stripped. The tree groaned like an old man kicked awake. Mason shook his head. She didn't belong out there, not really, not yet. And the orchard knew it. The trees leaned wrong, grew tangled and resentful, the way things do when they've been left alone too long. You had to know how to approach them, where to cut, what to leave. She didn't, but she was trying, harder than most would have. He could have helped, could have walked over, handed her the loppers with the ratchet mechanism, shown her the clean cuts, the ones that encouraged growth. But he didn't. Instead, he turned back to the coop, muttering under his breath. If she wanted to make that orchard hers, she'd have to bleed for it first, just like he had. By the second week, the weeds were winning. They came fast, too fast for her to keep up. Creeping thistle, bindweed, Johnson grass thick as rope. The kind that didn't just take root, but spread like a warning. Every row she thought she'd cleared was overrun by the next morning, the soil cracking beneath her boots, the heat pressing down like judgment. June tried. God, she tried. A borrowed hoe blistered her hands. She spent a full afternoon digging out a single patch by hand, nails packed with dirt, sweat stinging her eyes. The roots were deep, old, and spiteful. The field looked back at her like it knew better, like it was waiting for her to quit. She didn't, not yet. But the morning she finally walked into the co-op, she knew what she'd see before the bell above the door even finished ringing. A group of men clustered near the register, boots kicked out, hands wrapped around coffee mugs like they had been welded there, mouths full of weather and memory, and the sound of their own certainty. She stepped inside, and the conversation dipped just enough to sting. She asked about cover crops, about organic weed suppression, about whether it was too late to solarize half the field. The kid behind the counter blinked at her like she'd asked about quantum physics. Then came the voices, low, but not low enough. "She's wasting her time," one said, chuckling into his mug. "Bought a mess with good money. Should have let that land rest in peace." "Bet you 20 she's gone by fall." They weren't trying to whisper. They wanted her to hear. June straightened. She was tired, streaked in sweat, dirt across her cheek like war paint she hadn't noticed. But her voice didn't shake when she thanked the clerk, bought a bag of ryegrass seed, and turned to leave. That's when she saw him, Mason, standing by the exit, just inside the frame of the door. He didn't speak, didn't look at her. But his jaw was set tight, and his eyes lingered on the group like he wanted to say something and didn't. She brushed past him without a word. Outside, the sun was merciless. So were men like that. But the weeds weren't going to pull themselves. The sky lied. All day it had teased her, thick clouds rolling in slow from the west, dragging their shadows like bruises across the fields. Thunder grumbled in the distance, low and threatening, and the wind picked up just enough to raise hope, just enough to make her think maybe, this time. June stood in the middle of her field, eyes on the sky, hands dirt-crusted and trembling. The kind of trembling that comes when everything you've bet on is slipping through your fingers, and there's no one left to blame but yourself. The air went electric. The smell of rain was close, so close it made her chest ache. But then the storm rolled over the ridge and kept going. No rain, just wind, and the crack of dry thunder mocking her from behind the trees. Dust kicked up around her like it was laughing too. She turned back to the lines she'd run that morning, PVC piping laid out like lifelines across her rows, zip-tied and hopeful, maybe too hopeful. Her makeshift pump had stuttered the moment the wind picked up. When she checked the connectors again, one had cracked clean through. Water had poured out like it was escaping, not helping. She slapped it shut, too late, soaked from shoulder to waist, hands slipping on the wet plastic. And then she sat down in the dirt. Right there in the middle of the field, surrounded by weeds, mud, and the broken pieces of a system she didn't really understand. Her hair was plastered to her forehead. Her jeans were soaked at the knees. She cried. Quiet at first, then harder, not loud. Just the kind that sneaks up your throat and forces itself out, tight and messy and mean. She didn't hear the footsteps, just saw a pair of boots stop in front of her. Mason didn't say anything. His flannel was rolled to the elbows, sweat and grit on his forearms, his face unreadable. In one hand, he held out a wrench, his old one, the grip worn smooth. She blinked up at him, tears mixing with rainless mud. He didn't ask if she was okay, didn't ask what broke. He just crouched beside her and started fixing what he could. The pipe hissed like a warning when they turned the valve. Not the clean kind of hiss that meant things were flowing steady, but the desperate, stuttering kind, like the line itself, was gasping. Mason knelt in the dirt, one hand wrapped tight around the new coupling, the other bracing the pipe as it bucked beneath his grip. Water surged, then slipped back, then surged again. "Right there," he muttered. "Feel that?" June crouched beside him, hair pulled back in a messy knot, strands sticking to the back of her neck. Her jeans were caked in dried mud, both knees ripped through. She was still breathing hard from hauling the replacement coil across the field, too fast, too stubborn to wait. She reached for the pipe, pressing her palm to the side near the join. He watched her, expecting the usual, her to nod without understanding, to pretend like she felt what he felt, just to move on. But she didn't. She went still. A long beat passed. Then she said, "There's air. Feels like it's choking." He blinked. She was right. "Air pocket in the main line," he said, almost surprised. "Smart ear." She didn't smile, just shifted back and reached for the wrench. "Show me how to bleed it out," she said. And so he did. They worked in silence, cut the valve, bled the line, fitted the T-connector, and resealed the end with hands that trembled less now. June moved careful, slow, like she was learning the pipe's language, not just following instructions. Mason handed her the clamp and let her fasten it herself. She double-checked the seal twice, then sat back, wiping sweat from her brow with a sleeve that left a streak of grit across her cheekbone. He almost told her. Almost said how his wife had always done the same thing, streaks on her face, dirt under her nails, swearing at the pump like it owed her money. But he didn't. Instead, he reached forward and nudged the valve. This time the water came clean, smooth and steady. June exhaled. "Next time," Mason said, voice low, "listen for the shift. You'll feel it before you hear it." She met his eyes, serious. "I will." And he believed her. She was there before the rooster. First time, Mason thought it was a mistake, some city girl misreading her alarm, showing up to prove a point. She stood at the edge of his field with a coffee thermos clutched like it might save her life, hair tucked under a ball cap that still had a price tag crease in the bill. She didn't speak, just lifted a hand. Not a wave. Just enough to say, "I'm not leaving." He didn't say anything either, just pointed toward the chicken coop and kept walking. Next morning, she was there again. Slightly more prepared, boots this time, not sneakers, though they looked barely broken in. She waited for him to acknowledge her. He didn't. Just handed her a bucket and nodded toward the nesting boxes. By day 3, he found her in the barn, sweeping without being told, lips moving to some tune only she could hear. She looked up when he walked in, didn't flinch, didn't apologize for the trespass, just said, "That pitchfork's got a split handle. You're going to stab your own foot if you keep using it." He didn't argue, just swapped it out. She wasn't good at anything yet, not really. She moved like someone who had watched 100 videos but never lifted the tools herself. But she didn't slow down, and more than that, she listened. When he showed her how to kneel properly for fence work, she adjusted. When he told her not to grip the hoe like a baseball bat, she changed her hold without getting defensive. And when the feed bin jammed and he told her to leave it alone, she waited a beat, then fixed it anyway. He started leaving small things out, coincidences, he told himself. An extra set of gloves on the bench, the wrench laid just so, the gate unlatched. She noticed every time. One morning he woke late, 20 minutes behind, walked outside to find the water already running in the far trough. June crouched beside it, sleeves pushed up, checking the spigot like she owned the place. He opened his mouth to say something, didn't, just picked up the shovel and got to work. By midweek, she could barely close her fingers. June kept showing up earlier and longer. If she was in pain, she didn't show it, not in her face. But Mason noticed. The way she cradled the rake differently, the wince she tried to mask when she lifted a pail of feed, the blood-stiffened bandage on her left palm wrapped hastily, already coming loose. She was chasing something. He could see it in the way she moved, too fast, too hard, like she was trying to outrun whatever had driven her here in the first place. She dug fence holes with the stubbornness of someone who didn't know when to stop, not when to start. He told her to pace herself. She said she was fine, the kind of fine that didn't last past noon. By 10, she was on her knees in the dirt, hammering in a stake with the side of a rock. The post driver sat 2 feet away, untouched. Her knuckles were raw. The tape she'd used to cover the worst blisters had slipped, revealing torn skin beneath, angry, open, oozing. He walked over without a word, took the rock out of her hand. She didn't fight him, didn't even look up. "Can't feel him anymore," she said quietly, staring at her palms. "That's not good," he replied, and walked off before she could argue. Inside the barn, he moved past his tools, past the clutter and crates, stacked from years he didn't talk about. Back corner, small box. He hadn't opened it in a long time. The gloves were still there, leather cracked, stitching loose along one thumb. They smelled like dust and oil and memory. He hesitated, thumb brushing the inside where the initials were stitched in crooked thread, A.H., almost faded out now. He thought about turning back, thought about pretending he hadn't seen her hands, but he didn't. He walked back out, held the gloves out to her without a word. June stared at them, then at him. She didn't ask whose they were, just took them gently, like she understood she wasn't just being handed leather, but history. She slipped them on slowly. They fit, almost perfect. Then she got back to work. The thermos was dented near the base, paint chipped, one of those mismatched flea market finds that looked like it had survived a kitchen fire and a decade in someone's attic. June set it down on the porch rail like it was an offering. No words, just a small clink of metal against wood, and a glance that said, "Try it if you want to." Mason didn't reach for it right away. He was elbow-deep in a leaky hose coupling, sweat darkening the back of his shirt, hands streaked with grit. She sat on the top step, boots off, socked feet tucked beneath her like it was her porch too. By the time he finished tightening the clamp and wiped his hands on a rag that used to be white, the coffee had gone lukewarm. He took a sip anyway. It was awful. Burnt and watery, the kind of bitter that lingered too long on the tongue. She watched him take it, tried not to smirk. He didn't flinch, didn't gag, just nodded once like it passed inspection, and took another swallow. She leaned back against the rail, one hand shading her eyes. "Used to be a barista," she said casually, briefly. "Got fired for mixing up syrups and swearing at the espresso machine." He huffed through his nose, almost a laugh. "Taste checks out." She smiled soft and quiet, and didn't press. The sun stretched across the fields, low and wide, bathing everything in the kind of gold that made dead crops look like they might grow again. Dust floated in lazy spirals, catching light like ghosts that hadn't figured out how to move on. They sat like that for a long while. No talking. Just the wind brushing past the porch posts, the faint clatter of something loose on the roof. Her shoulder almost touched his, but didn't. She sipped from the second mug she'd poured herself and made the same face he had. Still drank it. He didn't ask why she kept showing up. She didn't ask why he let her stay. Some silences didn't need filling. Some people didn't either. They just sat. Coffee, dust. And the kind of quiet that felt like something was finally settling. The door stuck, swollen from years of rain and neglect. June had to shoulder it open, the wood groaning like something alive and unhappy to be disturbed. Dust exploded inward in a slow, theatrical cloud, catching in her throat and making her blink hard. The house smelled like old cedar and damp earth, with a faint undercurrent of something sweeter, lavender maybe, long dried and forgotten. She stepped inside slowly, boots creaking against warped floorboards, each one a different pitch of warning. The air was still, heavy, like the house had been holding its breath and wasn't quite ready to let it out yet. Sunlight sliced through a broken pane, falling across a narrow hallway lined with cracked wallpaper and crooked frames. She paused at the first one, sepia-toned, the glass smudged with time. A woman in a high-collared dress stood in front of a barn that barely looked different than it did now. Chin tilted up, arms crossed, gaze firm. No husband, no ring, just the land behind her and a dog at her side. The name on the back was written in looping script, Eleanor Roth, 1937. June moved deeper, fingers grazing the edge of a shelf where a line of old spice jars sat like sentinels, dusty, sealed, still half full. The kitchen was small but squared with purpose, cast-iron pans still hanging by the stove like someone might come back to cook. She found a drawer half jammed shut and yanked it open, revealing a bundle of letters bound in ribbon. Most were addressed to Eleanor. None were answered. In the front room, the floor dipped near the fireplace. A small bookshelf leaned against the wall, its contents half collapsed. June crouched, pulling out a weathered journal. Inside, pressed between brittle pages, were clippings, crop reports, soil health trends, notes about grafting methods and rainfall. Scrawled margins read like arguments with time. Tried peaches again, damn things don't listen. Grapes holding, may try muscadine next season. She sat on the floor with the journal open in her lap, the house quiet around her, except for the faint creak of settling timber. Eleanor had never married, had never left. She'd built something alone, and when she was gone, no family came to claim it, just the bank. And now, her. June traced a finger along the edge of the photo still clutched in her hand. It felt less like an inheritance and more like a dare. The market buzzed with the low, constant murmur of too many voices, saying not enough to be heard clearly. That was how it always started. Thin comments, tight smiles, the polite tone of small towns that prided themselves on knowing everyone and trusting almost no one knew. The booths were lined with tomatoes stacked like red poker chips, rows of dusty peaches, and handmade soaps that smelled like things no one could name. June moved between them with quiet precision, basket tucked in the crook of her arm, head high, posture straight, like it had been practiced. Mason stood near the edge, hands in his pockets, pretending to study a barrel of sweet corn he didn't intend to buy. He wasn't watching her, not exactly, but his eyes kept finding her anyway. The whispers followed her like wind through tall grass. That's the girl bought the Roth place. No husband? Came out of nowhere, heard she paid cash. Trying to fix that orchard, waste of time. Probably another trust fund runaway looking for a project? June didn't flinch, didn't even glance in their direction. She kept moving, kept asking questions about soil pH and cover crops, pointing to basil plants and goat cheese like the words didn't scrape against her, but Mason saw it, in the way her fingers gripped the handle of her basket a little too tight, how her smile came a beat too late. She stopped at Old Man Dobbin's honey stand. He gave her a nod, but his eyes were cautious, like hers might be the kind of story that doesn't end clean. She asked about clover fields and bee migration. He gave her a jar of golden amber that glowed in the sun and didn't answer her question. Mason shifted his weight, heart tight. He could have stepped in, could have said something. Just a word to quiet the noise or remind them that land doesn't care who your daddy was, it just wants work. And she was working. But he didn't. He didn't walk away either. When she turned and caught his eye from across the market, there was something steady in her look. Not angry, not afraid, just clear. He nodded once, and that somehow was enough for both of them. The tractor gave up with a groan like something dying slow. June killed the engine, though it wasn't much of a mercy. Smoke hissed from under the hood, pale and sour, curling into the late-day heat. She stared at it a long moment, hands on her hips, jaw locked, dust clinging to her sweat-slicked neck. Then she climbed down and kicked the back tire hard enough to make the fender shudder. It didn't help. She'd already pulled the manual twice that week, pages smudged with oil and good intentions. But the machine was older than her and meaner in temperament. She couldn't keep pushing it, and she couldn't afford to replace it either. She didn't hear him coming. Mason's truck rolled to a stop at the edge of the field, a slow grind of gravel under worn tires. He didn't honk, didn't call out. Just got out, toolbox in one hand and a small rust-speckled carburetor in the other. June wiped her hands on her jeans and stood straight as he walked up. He nodded toward the smoking engine, expression unreadable. "Choked out?" he asked. "Won't idle. Keeps coughing," she replied, arms crossed, defensive, before she meant to be. He nodded once, Didn't comment on the smell or the way she'd duct-taped part of the fuel line 2 days ago. Just set the carburetor on the side rail and popped the hood like it was a patient he knew too well. "You bringing that to loan or to teach?" she asked, stepping beside him. He didn't answer, just handed her a wrench. They worked in silence, the kind that hummed just under the skin, elbows bumped, fingers brushed over tools. The sun dipped low behind the ridge, bleeding orange light across the metal shell of the tractor. Grease streaked June's cheekbone. Mason's shirt stuck to his back. "Try it," he said, after what felt like forever. She climbed up, turned the key. The engine coughed once, twice, and then caught, purring low and stubborn, like it had been waiting for someone who understood it. June looked down at him, a flush creeping up her neck. "Thank you." He didn't look up, just wiped his hands and said, "Don't thank me yet." It's still got a temper. But she heard what he didn't say. So do you. The paper was soft from folding, its edges curled, creased like it had lived too long in the bottom of a glove box or a coat pocket. June smoothed it out across Mason's kitchen table, weighed the corners down with a mug, a jar of nails, and the wrench he never put away. He stood with one hand on the back of a chair, the other wrapped around a cup of coffee he wasn't drinking. Outside, the wind was picking up again, early spring kind, full of threats and promise. Inside, the room felt too small for all the air between them. "It's rough," she said, tapping a sketch of the Roth orchard, now rendered in pencil, and too much hope. "But if I stagger the beds here, I can start a small CSA by next season. Just a few families. Build it up from there, and over here near the ridge, a couple of raised plots for a community garden, shared tools, classes, workshops, maybe eventually a retreat, quiet weekends, nature stuff. People need quiet." Mason's eyes didn't leave the paper, but the scoff came anyway, low, dry. She heard it. Of course she did. "Something funny?" she asked, voice flat but sharp at the edge. He shook his head. "Just thinking how dreams like that don't grow in soil this dry, not without money, and a hell of a lot more patience than most folks have got." June stared at him. "I didn't ask for a loan." "No," he said. "You asked for something worse. Belief." He didn't mean it to sting, but it did. She pulled her hands back slowly, folding the map with too much care, like she was putting something delicate away before it shattered. The silence stretched, tight, uncomfortable. "I know it's a lot," she said finally, "and I know what people think when they see me, but this isn't just some phase. I came here to stay. I came to build something that gives more than it takes." Mason didn't respond, just stared out the window, watching the wind ripple across his dead field. "Then start with that," he said quietly. "Build something that survives the first storm. Then we'll talk about dreams." The frost came in without warning. Forecast had called for a mild dip, 40s maybe, nothing serious. Mason hadn't even covered his last row of kale. But by dawn, the ground was white, sugar-coated and brittle. Ice feathered out across the barn windows like lace pressed by a cold hand. The sun came up slow, pale, and tired, and by the time it cleared the ridge, the damage had already been done. He didn't check his own field first. Instead, he looked toward hers. The Roth place sat quiet. Too quiet. No movement near the orchard, no boots crunching through frost-bitten weeds, no hum of her engine, no clatter of tools. The plastic she'd laid over the garden beds had sagged under the weight of the cold. His chest tightened when he saw it. He told himself it was just the weather, just sympathy for a loss. But that wasn't the whole of it. She didn't come by that morning, or the next. On the third day, he sat on the edge of his porch steps with a cup of coffee that had gone cold, watching her front door like it might open if he stared hard enough. It didn't. Her truck was parked at an odd angle, one tire sunken deep into the muddy rut by the side path. There was a tarp flapping loose on the orchard fence, tangled in the posts like a flag half raised and forgotten. He knew what had happened. She'd planted early, too eager, too hopeful. Her seedlings were young, fragile, barely rooted. A frost like that didn't kill loud. It just stopped things from starting. He remembered that kind of silence, after the barn fire, after the miscarriage, after the last fight with his wife that never got answered. Silence like that didn't mean someone was fine. It meant they were holding their breath, waiting to see if the ruin would speak. Mason stood, set the cup down on the railing, and grabbed his coat. He didn't have a plan, didn't have the right words. He just started walking. The frost had melted by then, but the cold hadn't left. Neither had the ache that came when something you tried to grow didn't make it. She showed up just after sunrise, boots caked in mud, hair shoved under a knit cap like she couldn't be bothered with vanity. Mason spotted her from the field, just a figure bent low over the far end of the orchard, sleeves already soaked to the elbow, hands deep in soil that was still too cold to forgive. He didn't call out, didn't ask where she'd been. She was back. That was enough. June moved like someone with something to prove, shoulders tight, breath fogging in the cold morning air. Her jeans were soaked at the knees and the paper in her hand, some kind of planting chart, handwritten in pencil and half smeared, kept slipping in the breeze. She pinned it down with a stone and knelt again, scattering seed with care that bordered on reverence. Cover crops, clover, rye, hairy vetch, soil builders. She was rebuilding from the bottom up. Mason watched her for a long minute before heading to the shed, grabbed his extra trowel, a bucket of starter compost, and walked down the ridge without a word. She didn't look up when he stopped beside her, didn't flinch either, just shifted slightly so there was room for him in the row. "Red clover's stubborn," he said quietly. "Needs a touch of lime if the soil's sour." She nodded. "It's sour." He passed her the compost, and they worked in tandem, hands in dirt, rhythm slow and steady. No talk about the frost, or the lost seedlings, or the 2-day silence that had stretched long and bitter. No apologies. Just the sound of soil giving way, the scrape of roots pulled clean, the whisper of seed on earth. At one point her hand brushed his. Brief, accidental. She didn't pull back, neither did he. Later she stood, brushing dirt from her knees, and looked out over the rows they'd just finished. Her breath hitched, just once, like something too heavy was lodged in her ribs. "I thought it was over," she said. "I almost let it be." Mason didn't look at her when he replied, "Some things don't start right until they've failed once." She didn't smile, but she didn't cry either. She just went back to planting. The cultivator was older than both of them, rust flaking along the handles, the blades dulled from years of cutting through soil that gave less with each season. Mason hauled it out from the shed like he was waking something up that hadn't been touched in too long. He set it down with a grunt, wiped his brow, and gestured toward it without ceremony. "You want to build something real," he said. "You start here." June stared at the tool like it might bite. Her hands were blistered, bandaged, and too small for the grip. But she wrapped her fingers around the wooden handles anyway, adjusted her stance like he'd shown her, and shoved. It caught on the first pass, stuck in a patch of thick root. She swore under her breath, rocked it back, tried again. Mason watched her quietly, arms crossed, only stepping forward when the blade snagged a second time. "Loosen your grip," he said. "Let the weight do the work." She exhaled through her teeth and did as he told her. The cultivator groaned, then eased forward a few inches. Dirt turned. She looked up at him, face flushed with effort. "That's better," he said, and nodded once. "Keep going." By the time they hit the second row, she was moving easier, slower, but smoother, finding the rhythm. He didn't hover, just stayed close. Her hair came loose in strands, sticking to the sweat at her neck. She didn't complain. That night, after dinner, she brought her laptop to his kitchen table. He eyed it like she'd set a rattlesnake on the wood. "I told you I don't need—" "You said you don't know how," she cut in gently. She opened a browser window and started typing, voice soft but sure as she walked him through headers, image uploads, the difference between .com and .org. He followed her hands more than her words, watching the way she moved, calm, focused, capable. They spent an hour building a single page, a name, a photo, a few lines about soil health and seasonal harvests. "You're not going to fix this place online," he muttered. "No," she said, eyes on the screen, "but it might keep it from disappearing." He didn't argue. Hope, it seemed, had a strange way of changing hands. The letter came in a plain envelope, no logo, no pleasantries. Just his name, printed sharp across the front, and a return address he didn't need to read to recognize. Mason stood by the mailbox longer than he should have, thumbs rough against the paper, already knowing what waited inside. He didn't open it until after dinner, after the sun had gone, and June had headed back across the field with a wave and a soft good night. He waited for the quiet, the kind that let bad news echo louder. At the kitchen table, under the weak bulb that buzzed when it got too warm, he slit the envelope open with a steak knife and unfolded the pages with a care that felt like dread. Final notice. Missed payments. Grace period expired. 30 days. He read it once, then again, slower. Then folded it clean and slid it into the drawer beneath the silverware, beneath a warranty from a tool he no longer owned and a recipe card in his mother's handwriting that he hadn't looked at since the funeral. He didn't say a word. The next morning, June let herself in through the side gate, arms full of seed trays and a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She moved through the kitchen like it belonged to both of them now, talking about soil temperature and rainfall and some grant application she wanted to try. Her voice filled the space easily. She was halfway through rinsing a tray when she saw the drawer open, the envelope half sticking out. She didn't ask. Just pulled it free, unfolded it, read it standing still. He walked in a minute later to find her holding the letter, her face pale and set. Her eyes found his. "You weren't going to tell me?" "It's not your problem," he said flatly. "Like hell it's not." "I don't need saving." Her voice dropped. "I wasn't offering to save you. I was offering to stand beside you." He turned away. "Same damn thing?" The silence stretched, pride sitting between them like another person. She set the letter on the counter, firm and deliberate. "Then you'd better figure out what you're willing to lose before it decides for you." And she walked out, the screen door slapping behind her like punctuation. The barn hadn't seen a real dance in a decade, maybe more. The floorboards creaked under the weight of too many boots and the buzz of too many conversations. String lights hung from the rafters, swaying slightly with each draft that slipped in through gaps in the old wood. The music was too loud, too cheerful, fiddles and steel guitar trying to chase off years of quiet. Mason lingered by the far wall, arms crossed, watching like someone waiting for an exit to open. He hadn't wanted to come. Told her flat out that he didn't do town things. June just smiled, said it wasn't about town, it was about showing up, that she needed a reason to wear the dress she'd been saving, that she'd only ask once. She looked different tonight. Not polished, not dressed up like the women trying to impress someone, just soft, hair half down, boots scuffed but clean, a simple dress the color of dusk. She moved through the crowd like she didn't notice the stares, or maybe just didn't care. People did stare. He felt it, the way heads tilted, how voices dipped when they passed. That's him. That's the girl from the Roth place. Wonder how long she's staying. Mason kept near the shadows, sipping lukewarm punch that tasted like it regretted being poured. June found him anyway. She didn't ask. Just stepped close, hand out, eyes steady. "It's one dance," she said. He looked at her hand like it might burn him. Then, slowly, he set down his cup and took it. The music shifted into something slower, less fiddle, more slide guitar, the kind of song built for memory. They moved stiff at first, his hand awkward on her waist, her steps too quick. But they found the rhythm. It wasn't graceful, it wasn't pretty. But it held. The rest of the barn faded. The whispers stopped mattering. Her eyes were on his, and his were trying not to memorize the way she swayed when the chorus hit just right. He didn't know how to dance, not really. But somehow, neither of them stepped on the other's feet, and neither one let go. The sky turned green around the edges. That was the first sign. Not the distant thunder, not the wind that swept in sudden and wrong, but the color, unnatural and heavy. The kind of sky that made animals quiet and farmers watched the horizon with their breath half held. Mason stood in the barn doorway, eyes locked on the rolling edge of clouds, one hand resting on the frame like it could steady him. The roof had been holding, barely, patches of metal lashed down with old rope and stubbornness, but the last gust lifted one side just enough to show daylight through, and daylight in a sky like this was a threat. He grabbed the ladder, the tarp, a roll of old zip ties he wasn't sure would hold. The wind picked up, tugging at the edges of the barn, making the beams groan in protest. Then her truck pulled up. June climbed out without hesitation, hair in a braid, jacket already soaked through. She didn't knock, didn't ask. Just opened the bed and started hauling supplies, extra tarps, tie-down stakes, gloves. "You shouldn't be here," he said, voice low over the wind. "Neither should that roof," she shot back, handing him the better ladder. Lightning cracked open the sky, too close. They worked fast, climbing side by side, tarps snapping like angry sails. She moved with more grit than grace, hands shaking but sure. He barked instructions, pull tighter, higher, hook that side to the rafter, but she was already doing it. The rain hit hard, sudden and loud. The tarp whipped and pulled, catching wind like a kite trying to break free. June lost her grip once, slid halfway down the slick metal, caught herself with a curse and a bare hand that tore open on a rusted bolt. She didn't stop. Blood mixed with rain. They didn't speak again until the last zip tie cinched tight, the last corner secured. The barn held. So did they. Soaked to the bone, breathless, they stood in the hayloft while thunder rumbled past like a freight train no one could stop. Mason looked at her, rain dripping from the tip of his nose, words caught in his throat. June just nodded once, chest heaving, eyes sharp. And in that storm-wrapped quiet, something shifted between them, something fierce and fragile, lashed together by necessity, but holding all the same. The posts leaned like old men, weather-beaten, bowed, some snapped clean where the rot had won. The wire hung loose in places, slack and rusted, caught up with weeds and memories. Mason pulled out the first post with a grunt, roots clinging to the bottom like it didn't want to let go. June stood a few yards down, gloves on, sleeves rolled, digging out the next. They worked in silence for a while, not the easy kind, the kind that hummed just below the surface, restless, the kind that held back words neither of them wanted to be the first to say. When they finally strung the first stretch of new wire, the sun had climbed past its forgiving angle and into the part of day that burned. June wiped her brow with the back of her arm, leaving a smear of dirt across her temple. She didn't seem to notice. She drove the next post with slow, deliberate swings, then paused, leaning on the handle, breathing hard. "You ever wonder why it's here?" she asked. "This fence, this exact line." Mason tightened a bolt on the far end, eyes fixed on the task. "Keeps livestock in." "You don't run livestock." He didn't answer. She set the sledgehammer down, glanced out across the field. Her orchard on one side, his cracked pasture on the other. "You think whoever built it was trying to keep something out, or in." He looked at her then, something unreadable passing over his face. His hands were calloused, streaked with rust. "Does it matter?" She shrugged, but there was weight behind it. "I think it does. I think lines like this start somewhere real. Then people forget what they were for, and just keep fixing them anyway." He tightened the wire another half turn, enough to make it sing, and stepped back. "Habit's easier than change." She nodded. "Yeah, it is." They stood on opposite sides of the fence now, close enough to touch, but something about the wire made it feel farther than that. She placed a gloved hand on the new post, traced the grain in the wood. "I don't want to build things just to keep people out," she said quietly. He didn't say she was wrong, he just moved to the next post. But he didn't rush. And this time, he waited for her before setting it in the ground. The crows came at dawn, black smudges against a bruised sky, sharp and deliberate. June heard them before she saw them, the harsh cawing like a dare thrown across her rows. When she stepped outside, boots unlaced and jacket half on, they were already in the beds, pecking, tearing, clawing at the tender green that had barely taken root. She shouted once. It didn't matter. They scattered, but only just, landed on the posts, on the low limbs of the orchard, watching her with heads cocked, unbothered. One even hopped sideways along the rail, bold as sin, a seedling still clutched in its beak. She threw a rock. It missed. By the time Mason arrived, she was knee-deep in mud, hands trembling, her breath shallow from running in useless circles. Half the lettuce was gone, the rye shoots trampled. She stood there, fists clenched at her sides, eyes glassy with the kind of frustration that's too old to be called panic and too raw to be called anger. He didn't say anything at first, just looked at the damage, then looked up. "They always come early," he said. "First sign of life, they show up like they own it." June didn't turn. "They tore up half my work. They don't know better, they're just doing what they've always done." "Yeah, well," she muttered, "so am I." Mason moved past her, quiet, picked up a few stones, set them down again, pulled some old ribbon from his coat pocket and tied it to a stake. The wind caught it, made it dance. "They remember faces," he said finally. "If you scare 'em once, really scare 'em, they won't come back, not for a while." She looked at him, lips pressed tight. "And if they do?" "Then you remind them." He walked her through it, how to stand just so, how to raise your voice not in panic, but with purpose. He taught her how to move like someone not to be messed with. She listened. Later, when the crows circled back and she stepped forward, arms wide, voice steady, they flew. She turned to him, wind tugging at her sleeves, and smiled, faint and defiant. "They remember faces," she echoed. Mason nodded. "So do fields." The basket was small and it leaned. The handle had cracked during the carry. June had taped it with painter's tape and hope, and the bottom sagged under the weight of its contents. Tomatoes, deep red and warm from the sun, a few still clinging to their stems like they didn't quite want to let go. A pair of crooked yellow squash nestled at the bottom, curled like question marks. Sprigs of rosemary and basil were tucked on top, still damp from rinsing, their scent cutting through the dust in the air. She walked the path to Mason's porch, with her arms wrapped around it like it might fall apart if she loosened her grip. Her boots were caked with the morning's mud, her hair pulled back with more practicality than style. There was soil under her nails, a smear of something green on her cheek she hadn't noticed. She didn't try to fix any of it, not today. He was on the porch, sitting in the same chair he always used, the one with the slat that creaked under his left shoulder, coffee in hand, eyes on the horizon like the land owed him a sign he hadn't gotten yet. She stopped at the steps and held the basket out, arms extended. Not quite an offering, not quite a victory lap. "They're not much," she said, not looking at him. Mason didn't move right away, just let the silence settle the way it always did between them, slow, unbothered. Then he stood, stepped down, took the basket gently, like it weighed more than it did. He looked at the contents without saying a word, ran his thumb over one of the tomatoes, then looked back at her. "They're yours," he said. "Simple. No sugar in it. Just truth." She nodded, trying to swallow the tightness in her throat. "I wasn't sure anything would take." He looked toward the fields, toward the patchwork of green pushing its way through the soil, stubborn and uneven. "You planted it," he said. "That's the hard part." She let herself breathe, just a little. And for the first time, the basket didn't feel so small. The call came in just after noon, while June was scraping mud from her boots and halfway through writing out a seed order she couldn't afford to fill. Her phone buzzed once, then again, then fell silent. Unknown number. She almost let it go. The voice on the other end was smooth, clipped, practiced in the way people sound when they've never had dirt under their nails. He said her name like it belonged on a business card. He knew things, details she hadn't given out, acreage, property lines, aerial views from a drone she never saw. He complimented the layout, the charm, said the orchard had narrative appeal, said rustic was trending again. Then he named the number. June sat down hard on the back steps, phone pressed to her ear, the world narrowing into silence around her. It was more money than she'd seen in one place, more than enough to buy back time, to finish Mason's repairs, to pay off both farms and have something left over. Safety, comfort, all of it wrapped in clean contracts and a promise that her land would be reimagined into something for weekenders and influencers who'd never had to wrestle with a frost line or wake up wondering if the seedlings had made it through the night. She said she'd think about it. The man said he'd call back in a week. Then the line went dead. June sat there a long time, her fingers curled around the phone like it might change its mind. A breeze moved through the orchard, brushing against the new leaves she'd coaxed back to life. The fence they'd rebuilt creaked somewhere behind her. Across the field she could just make out the top of Mason's barn, the roof patched now, steady, holding. She didn't tell him, not that day. She folded the offer slip and tucked it deep into her coat pocket, where it crinkled like a secret every time she moved. Mason didn't ask why she was quiet that night, why her smile didn't hold, or why her hands fidgeted with the cuff of her sleeve. And she let the lie sit, just a little while longer. The first box was tucked near the front door, half hidden behind the coat rack, like it was waiting to be forgotten. June had packed it slowly, carefully, books, mostly, manuals on soil pH, irrigation guides, a few dog-eared cookbooks she never used but couldn't bring herself to throw out. Nothing urgent, nothing that would look like goodbye. But the second box came faster, then a third, and soon they lined the hallway like a trail of decisions she wasn't ready to say aloud. It wasn't a yes, not yet, just preparation, just in case. The flyer had slipped from between a stack of papers, thicker stock, glossy, the kind you don't print at home. Mason found it when he came to drop off the irrigation parts he'd promised to help install. He knocked, called her name once, and let himself in when she didn't answer. The house was quiet, too quiet. The flyer lay face up on the kitchen table, next to her coffee, cold, untouched. He read the words twice. An immersive glamping experience, orchards, rustic wellness, curated retreat escapes, investment-backed and shovel-ready. She stepped in from the back door, dirt still on her knees, hair tied back in a rushed knot. Mason, you weren't going to say anything? She stopped cold. Her jaw worked, but no words came. He held the flyer up between two fingers like it might burn. You packed half the hallway. You've been planning this. I wasn't... She stopped herself, exhaled. I wasn't sure. I thought you were staying. I thought I had to fix everything first, she said, voice sharp now, edged with something brittle. The money, the soil, the roof, you. I thought maybe if I made it work, really work, it would mean something. It does mean something, he snapped. You made it grow. She looked at him then, and something cracked in her expression. So why does it still feel like I'm waiting to be told I don't belong? He stared at her, stunned, silent. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the loose screen on the porch door. Inside, neither of them moved. Because the truth wasn't that she wanted to leave. It was that she didn't know if anyone would ask her to stay. The brush pile had been waiting for weeks. Dried limbs, stacked like brittle bones at the edge of Mason's field, half covered with a tarp and forgotten until forgetting was no longer an option. It was mostly orchard cuttings, thorned branches, snapped cedar limbs, tangled weeds he couldn't save. things too damaged to compost, things that didn't serve anymore. He lit it just after dusk. The match flared bright against the wind, and then the fire took, slow at first, reluctant, like even the wood wasn't ready to go. But heat always wins out. Within minutes, the flames were tall and wild, throwing orange against the sky like a second, smaller sun. June didn't say anything when she walked up. She just stood beside him a few feet away, arms wrapped around herself, wind tugging at the loose edge of her sleeve. Her face was quiet, unreadable, but her eyes were fixed on the fire like it owed her something. He didn't look at her, just watched the flames snap and hiss. "I used to do this after harvest," he said finally. "Cleared the dead to make room for the next season. Thought maybe if I got rid of the worst of it, the good would grow easier." June's jaw tightened. She stepped a little closer to the edge, the warmth brushing her face, sharp and dry. "You think it worked?" she asked. He shook his head once. "Only thing it did was make the field look cleaner, didn't stop the rot if it was already in the roots." The fire cracked, throwing sparks into the wind. One caught and floated high, trailing like a thread about to snap. He glanced at her then, eyes dark and steady. "If you go," he said, "take the good roots with you, but leave the fence." She turned toward him, the flicker of flame reflected in her eyes. "Why?" "Because some things need boundaries," he said, "even if they were never meant to divide. Just hold." She didn't answer, didn't need to. They stood together in the firelight, the air thick with ash and the kind of silence that speaks louder than any goodbye. The morning was cold in a way that didn't match the calendar. Late spring, but the wind still carried the bite of doubt. Mason was in the field early, walking rows that needed trimming, hands in his coat pockets, breath fogging in the air like smoke from something still smoldering. The fire from the night before had burned itself out, but the ash clung to him, to everything. He didn't hear the truck, but he felt the shift in the air when she stepped out of it. June stood at the edge of the field, her hair pulled back tight, sleeves pushed up. In her hands were 2 cups of coffee, real ones this time. No burnt aftertaste, no reused filters. The kind of coffee you take seriously when you're trying to say something without tripping over the words. She walked toward him slowly, not with hesitation, but with care. Like she knew the soil was soft, and she didn't want to break what had just begun to settle. When she reached him, she held one of the cups out. He took it, didn't sip. "The investor's gone," she said. Her voice didn't waver, not this time. "I told him no, told him it wasn't for sale, told him it never really was." Mason stared at her, jaw tense, eyes tired. "I'm staying," she said, "if that's all right." The words hung there. Not a question, not really, but they needed room, needed something steady to land on. He didn't speak, didn't nod, just reached into his coat and pulled out the harvest knife, clean, sharp, handle smooth from years of use. He held it between them, not as a gesture, not as forgiveness, just an answer. She took it. The weight of it settled into her palm like it had been waiting for her. They stood there for a moment longer, boots in the dirt, coffee cooling in their hands, knife passed from one season to the next. No promises, no apologies, just the kind of morning where everything was exactly what it was, and maybe finally that was enough. The light hit different that morning. It spilled over the fields in thick sheets of gold, brushing every stalk and leaf with the soft weight of promise. Not the nervous kind, not the if it holds kind, the real kind, the kind that only shows up after you've earned it. The rows stood tall, full, bending just slightly under the weight of the season's work. Tomatoes blushed dark red, squash bloomed fat and crooked. Beans curled in on themselves like secrets ready to be shared. June was already out there, sleeves rolled, hair pulled back in the same careless twist she always used when the day was going to be long. Her hands moved confidently now, cutting, gathering, tying, each movement a muscle memory she hadn't had a season ago. Her jeans were stained, boots worn down at the heel. She looked like someone who belonged to the land, not someone trying to win it over. Mason joined her without a word, bucket in one hand, harvest knife in the other. They didn't need a plan. They just moved, side by side, eyes scanning, hands reaching, feet stepping in rhythm. No talking, no need. The wind came in slow gusts, lifting the edges of their shirts, bringing the smell of ripe earth and something faintly sweet, like endings that weren't really endings at all. A truck passed on the gravel road, slow and familiar. Jacob Lane, from the Miller farm. He leaned out the window, gave a nod. June glanced up, offered a tired wave. Mason lifted his hand too, reflex maybe, but it felt different this time. Jacob smiled, narrowed his eyes against the sun. "Looks like the new neighbor's doing all right." Mason didn't hesitate. "She's not the new neighbor," he said, voice low but firm. "She's the farm next door." June looked at him then, just for a second. No smile, no blush. Just that stillness between them that had started as distance and somehow turned into trust. He didn't look back at her, just reached into the vines and pulled another squash. And in the silence, something settled. Not finished, not perfect, but rooted. And that was more than enough.